I'm going to talk you through a Part A question from Theme 1F, Two Views of Jesus from the Eduqas A-Level. Remember that in Theme 1F, you have two scholars. You have Crossan and you have Wright. On the spec, it does say that you need to be prepared to compare those two scholars. And so you could be facing a compare question, or you could face a question just on NT Wright on his own. As always, I would advise you to have a look back at your specification, because there are, I think, 4 things that you need to know for NT Wright, and any of those 4 things could become a question. I have picked up in this question, which has been made up because there are no past questions for NT Wright, 2 of those things. So explain NT Wright's approach to and conclusions about the person of Jesus. So this is basically asking you, how does NT Wright think we should get to know Jesus? What's the methodology he suggests using? And then what does he claim about Jesus? Before I start to explain my answer, I just want to make a few quick disclaimers. First of all, I'm recording this at home and I have a family, including a toddler, who, like all toddlers, is not great at sitting in silence. And so if you hear odd noises in the background, that's probably him rather than anything sinister. Secondly, when I type these answers up, I sit down and type them up under exam conditions, and I give myself, for Part A, 20 minutes to type. So I'm not using notes or a Bible or a book. I am doing it from memory because that is what you are going to have to do. And so they are not perfect, and if I was to sit with my notes and go back and edit, they probably would be better, but that isn't the scenario that you are going to be in your exam. Furthermore, I'm typing in 20 minutes. Most of you are going to be handwriting in 20 minutes. And you're also, for the second question, possibly going to be a little bit tired, and so writing slightly slower. And so, having looked it up, you should be able to write about 600 words in 20 minutes. Admittedly, that leaves very little time for you thinking as you're writing, because that's just pure writing. This answer is 750 words, so it is a little bit long because I'm typing. But I thought you would benefit from having maybe a slightly more detailed answer that you could pick points from. So as I talk you through my answer, I'm going to highlight the skills that I am showing off. So in the exam, it is not just about who knows the most. It's also about who can answer the question. So that's where the linking back to the question comes in. And in the mark scheme, if your answer is highly focused on the question, you're placed much higher, as long as what you've written is correct, of course. And secondly, the examiner is looking for a good use of religious language and specialist terms. So they tend to be the words you just use in your PRE lessons, or the words that the scholar uses. Evidence and sources of thought, of wisdom. Now, you're not really building an argument like you are in Part B, but there are reasons why scholars make claims that they do, and so you're backing up the scholar's view. Sources of wisdom might be Bible passages, or it might be quotes from your scholar. You're not going to see me write out long quotes. I don't have the memory to do that, and I think it would be a waste of my memory capacity to be learning quotes when I could be learning content. But you will see me using little snippets. Scholars. Now, obviously, NT Wright is going to appear because this is an NT Wright question, but I know the examiner is going to be impressed if I include other scholars, and so I have deliberately done so. And those scholars include Crossan and Bultmann. The examiner will also be impressed if I refer to schools of thought, so things like Christian existentialism. And then now I'm going to talk you through, but as I'm writing, I'm not just regurgitating knowledge. I'm thinking to myself all of the time, could I use a different word? Could I get in a source of wisdom here? Can I match this view to a scholar? Have I linked back to the question recently? And talking of linking to the question, I am using a introduction, which is controversial. Some teachers will say that you should just get on and earn marks. And if you're someone who struggles with timing, that's probably good advice. But this introduction is literally going to take me a minute to write. It's going to calm me down, allow me to gather my thoughts, but also it's going to help me address the question at hand. So it would be really odd if I read the question, highlighted the key terms, did a quick plan, then wrote an intro using words from the question, and then failed to answer the question. So it's just a safety check. So the question is, explain NT Wright's approach. So I'm beginning with NT Wright's approach to the person of Jesus. I've picked up the person of Jesus here. And then this leads him to the conclusion that Jesus was the true Messiah, announcing the kingdom of God is at hand. As I'm writing, I can keep looking back not only to the title but also my introduction and ask myself, am I doing that? So I'm going to go first of all to my first paragraph, which is where I'm going to unpack and explain NT Wright's approach to forming a coherent picture of Jesus. So the first half of the question. I've named NT Wright's book just because I've read it and I know it. Please do not feel like you need to do that. So NT Wright is our first scholar, and I'm going to pick up a nice phrase here, so a source of wisdom of NT Wright. And so in this book he says that there have been endless and fruitless discussions about who the historical Jesus was. And if we're going to escape that endless and fruitless cycle that's getting us nowhere, we need to start to be critical of our own worldviews. And that's an NT Wright key term. And he says we are very quick to identify and be critical of worldviews of those in the past, so pre-scientific, for example, or believing in myths, but we tend to overlook the spectacles through which we see the world. And NT Wright suggests a new epistemological approach. Epistemology is just about the gathering of knowledge, and he calls that approach critical realism. You can't answer this question without using that phrase. And he contrasts two approaches to knowledge or schools of thought that he calls, or he doesn't call, they are phenomenalism and positivism. And so when talking about positivism, NT Wright says that we tend to think that we have unquestionable knowledge. So we use empirical knowledge or sense data to gather knowledge, and we assume that that is correct, and there isn't really another way of gathering knowledge. And so he calls that naive realism. And NT Wright says we need to be aware that that is our worldview, that is our epistemological approach, and returning to the question, that makes us reach certain conclusions about the person of Jesus. And we reject anything that isn't supported by empirical data, key term, and we have a tendency to want to demythologize the Bible to fit our post-Enlightenment worldview. And the worldview comes first. And so that's a nice link with Bultmann there, who I'm going to mention in a moment. Then the next school of thought is phenomenalism, and NT Wright refers to that as non-realism. And it's called non-realism because whereas naive realism says that there's knowledge out there and we've got it and we're definitely correct and there's no other way of forming knowledge, non-realism says there's no external objective knowledge. It's just about our own experiences and interpretation. There's a nice link here with ethics where we go from, this is right, this is wrong, I know that because there are objective laws, to then we end up with emotivism, and well, I don't know what's right or wrong, I just know how I feel about it. NT Wright says that isn't a path that we should be going down. And returning to the question, when it comes to then talking about Jesus, we end up somewhere that can be called Christian existentialism, where, the goal of getting to know Jesus is that you have your own personal understanding and your own personal relationship and interpretation, rather than there being one fixed objective truth about Jesus. And again, Bultmann is our scholar, and he's a good example of that when he talks about the resurrection being a faith event rather than a historical event. In contrast to that, critical realism says that we need to acknowledge that we are studying objective facts. So Jesus exists externally to our understanding of him. And in addition, we need to be aware that how we view Jesus is affected by our current worldview. And NT Wright says that your worldview is things like psychological states, expectations and assumptions. And so we don't build a picture of Jesus objectively. We carry with us all those subjective assumptions. So now we're going to apply that approach to understanding the figure of Jesus. I'm linking back to the question there. And NT Wright says that we have to acknowledge our worldview and acknowledge that that leads us to accept or reject certain information. We also need to acknowledge that our worldview is very different from that worldview of the writers of the Gospel. So they did not have a separation between the worlds of knowledge and faith in the way that we do. N.T. Wright uses this phrase, attic Christianity, which is where your faith becomes this sort of very private thing that you tuck away and is very, is separated from your objective, from history. And so N.T. Wright says that this clash of worldviews traditionally takes you down the route of Bultmann, where you reject everything that's mythical. But N.T. Wright sets you a challenge, and he says we have to be willing to accept that there is truth beyond our worldview. Some nice key terms there. He also says, to quote N.T. Wright roughly, that we need to be in dialogue with those other worldviews and perhaps abandon our existing ideas. And so when we approach Jesus, we're not approaching a person who doesn't exist in history, but also we shouldn't use history to constantly disprove Christianity. They're not in battle with one another. So then, taking that critical realist model, he then seeks to form a coherent picture of who Jesus was. And first of all, he says that Jesus is the true Messiah, and that Jesus is announcing the kingdom of God is near. You'll notice my paragraph's getting shorter because I'm running out of time. And Jesus, and you'll remember this word from the resurrection unit, has mutated. He's changed ideas of what it was to be a Messiah. And so Jesus is not a violent revolutionary. He's offering redemption. And he's modelling himself on, nice source of wisdom, the suffering servant motif of Isaiah. And Jesus' death, therefore, is not a sign of failure, which is what Crossan says, but instead it's core to the messianic mission. He has to die to offer that salvation. And N.T. Wright says, the only way that we can understand that Christianity exists today, and that Jewish people, or some Jewish people, the ones that went on to be Christians, would have accepted this adapted Messiah idea, is because there must have been a game-changing moment. And for him, that game-changing moment was the resurrection. That's our sort of event, our evidence there. So to repeat, the method that N.T. Wright uses is critical realism. Being aware of your world views, when talking about objective facts of Jesus as a historical figure, and that leads him to claim that Jesus was the Messiah who rose from the dead.